The Carpathian Mountains loomed tall and foreboding, their jagged peaks slicing through the sky like the teeth of a monstrous beast. The travelers, two pairs of English tourists, had heard the warnings and seen the suspicious glances of the locals, but their spirit of adventure was not so easily deterred. Charles Kent, the elder brother, was a man of science and reason, his practical nature undaunted by the superstitions of the rural folk. His younger brother, Alan, shared his curiosity, though tempered with a touch more caution. Their wives, Diana and Helen, had different temperaments. Diana was as adventurous as her husband, while Helen was more reserved, feeling an unease she couldn't quite shake off. They had met Father Sandor at the last village, a stout and serious man whose eyes seemed to hold 1,000 dark tales. His warning had been clear: turn back, for there are places in these mountains where evil still dwells. But the allure of the unknown and the beauty of the landscape had drawn them onward. As their carriage rumbled along the narrow, winding road, the sense of isolation grew. The towering trees of the dense forest cast long shadows, and the air grew chillier with each passing mile. Helen shivered and pulled her cloak tighter around her. "Do you think we should have listened to Father Sandor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles, sitting opposite her, gave a reassuring smile. "Nonsense, Helen. The priest was just trying to scare us with old wives' tales. There's nothing to fear here but the cold." Diana, sitting next to Charles, leaned forward. "And what a tale we'll have to tell when we get back to London. Can you imagine the look on their faces when we tell them we ventured into the heart of the Carpathians?" Alan, sitting next to Helen, remained silent, his eyes scanning the dense forest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he looked, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. The carriage jolted as it hit a rough patch of road, and the horses whinnied in protest. The driver, an old man with a weathered face, muttered something under his breath and urged the horses forward. He had been reluctant to take them this far, and his discomfort was evident. Night began to fall, and the forest grew even darker. The flickering lanterns on the carriage cast eerie shadows that danced along the path. Helen clutched Alan's arm. "I don't like this, Alan. It feels wrong." Before Alan could respond, the carriage came to a sudden halt. The driver jumped down and walked to the side of the road, his lantern held high. "There's an inn just up ahead," he called back to them. "We'll stop there for the night." Relief washed over Helen, and even Charles seemed pleased by the prospect of a warm bed. They gathered their belongings and followed the driver to the inn, a small, dimly lit building nestled among the trees. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, and the windows glowed with a welcoming light. Inside, the innkeeper greeted them with a nod, his eyes lingering a moment too long on each of their faces. "Rooms for the night?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, thank you," Charles replied. "We've been on the road for quite some time and could use a rest." The innkeeper nodded and showed them to their rooms. The walls were thin, and the sounds of the forest outside seemed to seep into the building. As they settled in for the night, the uneasy feeling persisted. Helen lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows seemed to move, and she thought she heard whispers just beyond the door. She turned to Alan, who was already asleep, and tried to push the fears from her mind. "It's just a strange place," she told herself. Nothing more. In the next room, Charles and Diana were also struggling to sleep. Diana rolled over and looked at her husband. "Do you think we made the right decision coming here?" Charles took her hand. "Of course, darling. We'll be fine. We'll rest tonight and continue our journey tomorrow. This is just the beginning of our adventure." But as the night wore on, the shadows grew darker, and the whispers grew louder, filling the travelers with a sense of dread they couldn't quite explain. The next morning, the travelers awoke to a heavy fog blanketing the forest. The sun was a pale disk in the sky, barely piercing through the thick mist. As they gathered for breakfast in the inn's common room, the atmosphere felt oppressively silent. Charles was the first to break the uneasy quiet. "Today we'll reach the castle. I've heard it's quite a sight." The innkeeper, who had been tending to the fire, glanced up sharply. "Castle? You're heading to the old castle?" "Yes," Charles replied, oblivious to the man's sudden pallor. "We've heard it's a place of great historical interest." The innkeeper crossed himself and muttered something under his breath. "It's a cursed place. Best stay away." Diana, ever the curious one, leaned forward. "Why is it cursed?" The innkeeper shook his head. "Stories. Old stories of things best forgotten. You'd be wise to heed the warnings." Helen shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "Maybe we should reconsider." But Charles, determined to press on, dismissed the warnings as more superstition. "We'll be fine. Let's get ready to leave." As they prepared to depart, Father Sandor arrived at the inn. His presence was commanding, and his expression was grave. "I see you're still set on your course," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Charles nodded. "We are. We appreciate your concern, Father, but we must see this through." Father Sandor sighed. "If you must go, then take this." He handed Charles a small, intricately carved crucifix. "Keep it with you, and may God protect you." Charles accepted the gift with a nod, though he didn't fully understand its significance. The travelers bid the priest and the innkeeper farewell and set off once more into the fog-laden forest. The road grew narrower and more treacherous as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Helen's unease grew with each passing mile. "This place feels wrong," she whispered to Alan. Alan squeezed her hand. "We'll be all right, Helen. Just a bit further." Finally, they reached the castle. It stood on a cliff, its dark silhouette outlined against the stormy sky. The massive stone structure was both imposing and beautiful, with high towers and intricate battlements. But there was something about it that seemed almost alive, as if it were watching them. The carriage came to a halt, and the driver, visibly anxious, refused to go any further. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice trembling. Charles, Alan, Diana, and Helen stepped out and approached the castle's enormous wooden doors. They creaked open with an eerie slowness, revealing a grand but dimly lit hall inside. The air was cold, and a strange silence hung over the place. "Welcome," a voice suddenly echoed through the hall. A tall, gaunt man appeared at the top of a sweeping staircase. His skin was pale, and his eyes were dark and penetrating. "I am Clove, the servant of the house. Please, come in." Despite the chill that ran down her spine, Diana smiled politely. "Thank you. We are travelers seeking shelter for the night." Clove nodded. "You are most welcome. Dinner will be served shortly. Please, make yourselves comfortable." As they were led to their rooms, Helen's sense of dread intensified. The castle's corridors were lined with ancient tapestries and dark paintings, their eyes seeming to follow them as they passed. In the dining hall, a grand feast awaited. The table was laden with food and wine, and Clove served them with an eerie grace. As they ate, the conversation was strained, each of them feeling the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. After dinner, Clove showed them to their rooms. "If you need anything, do not hesitate to call," he said, bowing deeply before retreating into the shadows. As they settled into their rooms, the travelers could not shake the feeling of being watched. Helen clung to Alan, her fear palpable. "I don't like this place, Alan. I want to leave. We'll see how things are in the morning," Alan said, trying to soothe her. "If you still feel this way, we'll go." In his own room, Charles examined the crucifix Father Sandor had given him. He felt a strange sense of comfort holding it, but he still couldn't bring himself to believe in the superstitions surrounding the castle. As the night deepened, the castle's shadows seemed to grow longer and darker. Strange sounds echoed through the halls, and the air grew colder. The travelers tossed and turned, unable to find rest. In the darkest hour of the night, a chilling wind swept through the castle, extinguishing the lanterns and plunging the halls into pitch blackness. The whispers began again, louder this time, and filled with an unmistakable sense of malice. Helen awoke with a start, her heart pounding. She felt a presence in the room, a darkness that seemed to press down on her. "Alan," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Something's here." Alan sat up, reaching for the lantern. But before he could light it, the door to their room swung open with a creak, revealing a tall, shadowy figure. "Who's there?" Alan demanded, his voice trembling. The figure stepped into the room, and the light from the hallway revealed Chloe's pale, menacing face. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice a low growl. "The master does not take kindly to intruders." With a swift, unnatural movement, Clove advanced on them, and the room plunged into chaos.